the largest of the large companies that are truly global. In the case of Walgreens Boots Alliance, over $135 billion of revenues. Sizes like that, Bank of Montreal size, 1.2 trillion in assets, seventh largest bank in North America. How does the board change? How does governance change?
It's quite different. I would say that there's more similarity than differences sometimes, an effective use of a board. Whether you're a small company or a big company, what you want to make sure is that you have the right people, and then as management and the CEO, that you have the right attitude about why they're there and how they can help you. And, the help that you might provide to a younger company, less mature, might be quite different than the help that you would provide to a well-established company that's got a lot of infrastructure around it.
All right. I want to welcome everyone to our latest Scale Community podcast. I'm joined by Jan Babiak. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
You are.
Okay, good. So very excited to speak to you today. Not every day that I get to sit with a former board member at companies like Walgreens Boots Alliance and the Royal Mail, Bank of Montreal, BMO, and a former managing partner at Ernst & Young and E&Y. An incredible resume. And so very excited to get into it with you, Jan.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just said thank you for having me.
My absolute pleasure. Okay, so first question for you is these large multi-billion-dollar international companies that you've been a board member of for many years, try to think back to smaller companies, mid-cap and maybe even micro-cap, which I imagine at some point, maybe in your E&Y days, you had exposure to. And I'd love for you to focus on the realities of scaling to call it phase 4. Phase 1 is young. Phase 2 is small cap, mid cap. Phase 3 is large cap. And then phase 4 is the uber cap, the largest of the large companies that are truly global. In the case of Walgreens Boots Alliance, over $135 billion of revenues. Sizes like that, Bank of Montreal size, 1.2 trillion in assets, seventh largest bank in North America. How does the board change? How does governance change? And I know there's a lot of packed into that question, public versus private, international versus domestic, but just are there these inflection points where walking into that boardroom, this must be a uber cap company?
Well, first of all, I don't necessarily have to go back to my EY days, because in my own portfolio, while I have the big public company boards, or have had, as some of them have changed over the years, I've also done some smaller, right down to startups, because I just find some of that quite interesting. I also find that it's a good way for me, particularly in technology, to kind of understand what's coming in terms of disruptors and things like that. I think it's quite different if you walk into one of these uber-sized companies and you know that it's 140 billion, or you know that it's 1.5 trillion in assets, because you take something like a big Canadian bank that's 200 and plus years old, then that kind of thing has already existed. I think it's quite different if you're starting and you go through the phases and moving from startup through to kind of a toddler, through to a teenager, through to fully grown company. It's going to depend on, first of all, whether you're in transition or whether you're at a plateau and where you're starting from. I would say that there's more similarity than differences sometimes. If you look at something like an effective use of a board, whether you're a small company or whether you're a big company, what you want to make sure is that you have the right people on the board. And that's the starting point. And then as management and the CEO, that you have the right attitude about why they're there and how they can help you. And, the help that you might provide to a younger company, less mature, might be quite different than the help that you would provide to a well-established company that's got a lot of infrastructure around it.
So I always think about these mega companies as almost so complicated that no one really knows what's going on. They're continents into themselves, where there's so much happening in so many different directions and so many opinions that it's hard to really aggregate all of that into a cohesive understanding of reality. Is that accurate? Given your ability to see through different companies, different industries, different sizes, does that sense that everyone's really guessing get highlighted and exaggerated the larger the company gets, or can you still stay on top of things in an Uber cap?
Well, I think that first of all, you have to understand that it's something that's very large. This is not a sole proprietorship where, in a smaller company where you may have a founder or you may have someone who knows everything because the company is smaller. You would not expect that in a large company. So what you're looking at in one of these larger ones is, are there people who wake up every day thinking about compliance and health and safety and sales and cost management? And you're wanting to make sure that the universe of considerations is covered. And, where you end up with the big problems is where you end up with a gap at some point. You don't have somebody who wakes up every day thinking about internal audit or wakes up every day thinking about those big contracts or big contract renewals or something like that. And I think that's a big part of the leadership's role in these big companies. I mean, you're not expecting, if you were a big technology company, you don't expect your CEO to be coding, so but he or she may have a big responsibility for making sure that we've got, the best coders, on the planet to move this forward, who have the right vision and everything like that. And I think when you think about the board, it's team play. If you want to use, let's say, a baseball analogy, if you had the 10 best pitchers on the planet, you probably wouldn't have a very good baseball team, because you need people who can bat, and you need people who can field, and you need, people who can catch, and all of the positions. And boards are much the same way in that, you don't want 10 people who are all alike. You want people who, some of whom come from strong financial backgrounds, some of whom come from big sales backgrounds, some who will be in adjacent industries as part of the supply chain. And then, you don't feel that responsibility to know everything about the company, because, that's not possible.
Let's talk about functioning versus dysfunctional boards. So you've seen it all, and you have a view in mind of what a high functioning, best in class, A+ board looks and feels like. I imagine the board members are not there for purely perfunctory reasons. They are there for real debate and engagement. I imagine, and this is my attempt at maybe a top 3 most important list for high functioning, and feel free to push back and tell me my top 3 is wrong or right. So let's put on the list: highly engaged board, open forum, debate, discussion, real knowledge sharing, and high intelligence gathering, right? Ahead of critical decision making. So decisions are being made. So as opposed to, hey, we're just here to say yes to whatever the CEO wants. 2, highly balanced. So instead of, I don't know, you'll tell me, a day's worth of board discussion on one topic and that's it, we're done. We just spoke about growth. We never covered cost. We never covered HR and employee morale. We never covered compliance. Like all these topics we just left off table because the CEO only wants to talk about growth. That would be 2 examples, opposite end examples of high functioning versus low functioning. And then maybe a third functioning is a highly innovative board that opens the door to creative R&D discussion, use of imagination to explore what's possible. So instead of just limiting to the conversation to the now, near term, quarterly earnings, right? This calendar year's performance, have we left time for the board to act in its best sense as part of the vision making machine, the head of the organization mapping out the next 10 years. And maybe that doesn't happen every board meeting on a quarterly basis. Maybe that happens once a year. But sort of that, those would be my guesses of what I think and hope, because I've never been a board member of a multi-billion-dollar Uber cap multinational business. Not even close. I would say my father has, and I got interesting anecdotes from him. I think he was a board member on Hertz, if I'm not mistaken, the rental car company. But he avoided it too. He avoided the idea of the politics and the administration and the complexity. So he stayed more in the mid to small cap private sphere his whole life. So we all, us outsiders that don't get to be inside of these huge public company boards, we don't know. You watch a documentary or TV show about the politics of these massive businesses, or you read a book about it, we're guessing, you're there, you're in the rooms. Are these the metrics, the KPIs that drive output for you in terms of performance, or have I missed the mark?
Well, Roy, you packed a whole lot into that
Yes,
question.
it's a long question.
It is a very long question. And even in your first one put about 10 things in it, all of which are quite important. But let me back up just a little bit and let's talk about the role of boards. Boards have three jobs, kind of at a high level. If we're going to use threes, I'll use three jobs. First of all is what I would call business as usual. So you've got to get, if you're a public company, in which we're talking about big Uber sized public companies, you've got to get the 10Q out every quarter. You've got to do the monthly, accounts. You've got to, make sales all the time, and that's happening no matter what's going on around you. You've got the business as usual, and you've always got to be having some look at the business as usual from a governance standpoint to kind of have oversight over it. The second category is you have to react to what's going on around you. And hopefully you've got a plan on the shelf, or at least you've thought about it and you're not shocked by it, but sometimes those things come along too. But you've got to be able to react. And then the third area, very important, is kind of your third, the innovation, looking at the future and looking at where you're going. So if you think about that, let's take an example. During COVID, business as usual still happened. Those 10 Qs still had to go out. You still, whether you were a retailer or a bank or whatever, you still had clients to serve. And believe me, if you're a bank, those clients wanted access to the money, even though they were at home. And, if you were in a pharmacy, then you needed to be, particularly during that time, filling prescriptions, which meant you had to have people on the front lines during difficult times. All of that business as usual. In the meantime, we're reacting dramatically. One board I was on, 50,000 employees, only 5,000 of them could work remotely. A week later, 50,000 people could work remotely. You would have never done a project plan that says, we're going to knock this out in a week. But,
or most recently, tariff.
Yeah. Well,
left, right, everyone has to react.
Exactly. And then you've got, the future. So what's the future going to look like with hybrid working? What are we going to have here and all that? All three of those jobs are happening simultaneously all the time. And so as you're looking at innovation, like you say, and looking at your second point around, balanced and all that, you've got to cover all three. But one of the things, again, about the larger companies, we also have very sophisticated committees. So something like compliance is probably flowing through your audit committee. Something around, employee engagement, talent protection, things like that is probably going through your HR compensation committee. And then many companies have additional committees. There are 3 required committees, as we all know, but they may have different special committees, whether that's, related to climate change, if that's going to be a big issue for your sector, or it may be technology or something like that. So the committees are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and then they get reported back to the board in a readout, but it's still being handled. And then there are other things that are kind of reserve powers of the board that are going to come to the board. And you made the comment about if the CEO only wants one topic. Well, I'm sorry, but you are dysfunctional if your CEO is defining your agenda, because the agenda should be developed in combination with the board, with, whether you have an independent chair or whether or not you have a lead director who should be engaged, should be, a figurehead kind of thing. It should be somebody who's looking at the agenda and saying that we want this. They're engaging with the board members to say, we're not really hearing enough about this subject. And then we're making those agendas what needs to be covered. This is not, an imperial kingdom where the CEO should be defining everything. Now that said, they should have a big say in it and how they're going to do it, and maybe the timing, but it should be in a collaborative effort around that. Your first point around engaged, open debate, etc. I think, the best way I describe an effective and functional board is where everyone understands they have an obligation to dissent, but they also have an obligation to disagree without being disagreeable. And they also have to listen to people in the room who may have more knowledge on a particular subject, because I spent a lot of my career in cybersecurity and technology. Often on my boards, if we're dealing with, one of those middle categories of reacting to things, a ransomware or, a big breach or something, the board's probably going to turn to me and ask me a little bit more about that than they might expect from others. But there are other people in the room, if we're dealing with a big compensation issue and you've got somebody who used to be CHRO for a big company, we might listen to that person more. Or, you work your way through the skill set. And that's why a board matrix which is sitting down and saying, what are all the skills you need? And have we got those covered off? And that's usually not a lot of one-trick ponies. It means, somebody, who has, like myself, I have general management experience, I have accounting experience, I have cyber experience, I have, international experience. But then you might have somebody else who has legal experience or who has a deep sector experience in, banking or healthcare or something like that. And you're putting together a matrix that says, we've got all this covered off. And then those individuals begin to influence not only the balance and the agenda, but making sure we're bringing innovation to it's a tapestry.
Highly organized, structured discussion, efficient discussion with representatives that are technical experts in their respective fields is really the goal, the ultimate goal. So not like the Trump cabinet meetings that I hear from inside sources are a lot of fun, and there's a beautiful agenda printed every time, but no one ever gets past the first topic.
I don't have any knowledge of what goes on in those rooms.
I'm not revealing my sources.
All right. Well, we'll leave that. But I think another thing that's very important, though, that makes boards flow, the engagement, the balance, and the innovation, not everything happens in the boardroom. So, I chair a large audit committee for one of these Uber companies. Well, yesterday I spent an hour with the head of internal audit, an hour with the finance director, an hour with the external auditors, and then today I spent because we've got a board meeting coming up in a couple of weeks. So we're preparing and looking at what they're presenting and what's going to be important and what we agreed at the last meeting we were going to present this time and all that. So particularly your committee chairs or individuals who have a particular deep expertise. We've got on one of my boards, we've got somebody, a very, very senior executive from IBM who flew to India to look at, the IT operations with the CIO to look through things. So not all of the work is done in this board meeting. And one of the things that I think makes for a very effective board, and I've been on ones that were dysfunctional, I guess using your language, but is what I call free range board members. I can talk to anyone I want to at any time. Now, there's two kind of rules around that. One of which is I have to remember that they have a day job and their day job isn't entertaining Jan. So, I need to make sure I'm thinking about, not just being a distraction, but actually doing this in a way that matters. And then the other thing is if I stumble across something that needs to be reported to the CEO or other senior leader, then I probably need to find a way to do that without throwing somebody under the bus. You shared that with me. But I was on a board once where the CEO did not let anyone meet with anyone on the team unless that it was booked through the CEO's office and they sent a minder with you to make sure that you didn't go off topic. I didn't last very long on that board because I was very unhappy with the limitations. And in fact, that board had quite a lot of challenges, but you learn these things and you also learn to do better due diligence so that later when you're board career, you don't accept roles like that.
That's another sort of mythological or maybe folklore component to board machinations, board dynamics that gets covered again and again and again. What happens when, certain power concentrations, power agents find themselves put to task, questioned by dissenting voices inside board dynamics, the difference being go left, constructive discussion, and enjoy the debate and let the best argument win, versus go right, let me get very Machiavellian and find a way to conspire with my fellow conspirators to remove the dissenting voice out of the board. Eject that person. And so it is, I would add that to the list of the definition of a high functioning board versus poorly functioning one is how often are the seats rotating and how much is there happy disagreement? Like if there's no disagreement ever and no discussion and no debate, that's probably not a good sign.
No, it's not probably. It is not a good sign. That is an absolute because now bear in mind that all of those debates don't have to happen in the boardroom. You can sometimes you'll get board papers and, a well-managed board papers will come out a week or so before, but you may, get a hold of other board members. You may get a hold of the CEO and go, I'm not comfortable with this. Can you, give me more information? Can you help me understand? A well-functioning board, there will be times when you come out with a different outcome. The idea of getting somebody off the board because they're in dissent, I think that's very old fashioned and very, very rare. I mean, you can always find, the exception that proves the rule. I think particularly if you have a good independent chair or a good lead director and, just a good culture for making sure that people's voices are heard. And frankly, if you're a board member on one of those boards and you don't feel that, you're making a contribution, you probably ought to think about resigning and going and doing something where you can make a contribution, because, you certainly don't do this for the money.
So I want you to think back about one of your examples, whether it's Bank of Montreal, Royal Mail, or any of the tech companies that you've been involved with, the finance companies financial institutions that you've been part of, tech-enabled financial institutions. You might have come across an acquisition of a subsidiary or been on the board long enough to see a CEO and his or her team, the agents, transition from mid-cap mentality, maybe even founder mentality, to uber cap, large global institution board mentality. And I think of you as someone, Jan, who is very deep in governance, audits, risk management, information security. You know what good is. And so what's been, like, I think of in healthcare, I think of GI Alliance being acquired by Cardinal Health. GI Alliance in 2018 was 60 physicians. It's now well over 1,000 positions, a couple of $1 billion of revenue. Don't hold me exactly to that. And part of Cardinal Health, which I could do ChatGPT. Let's do it. Let's go there. ChatGPT. How large is Cardinal Health? Revenues and FTEs. So Cardinal Health is $226 billion in annual revenues, 50,000 employees. And let's assume Jim Weber, who I think remains as the CEO of GI Alliance, he's certainly the founder, is invited into the board and has to speak on behalf of this subsidiary. And now he's reporting to a board that is responsible for $226 billion of annual revenues, 50,000 employees worldwide. What are the big differences? What's the wave that's going to hit him hardest in this new paradigm that he finds himself in? He's used to boards. He's been private equity owned, and he was owned by Ward Capital Private Equity. Then they did a management leveraged buyout with Apollo. He's seen institutions, but he's never been public company owned by a $250 billion behemoth. So if you were to focus him and say, what's changed? What would you say?
Well, I couldn't even tell you how many dozens of M&A deals that I've been involved in across my career where that was often the case, where something is acquired and bought into something else. Like one of the companies I was on, we sold to Hitachi for $9.6 billion. And when I went on the board, it was $200 million, and it sold into Hitachi, and so even at that size, it's just, part of, a much bigger ocean rather than, the local lake that it was in. I think it doesn't start with when they show up. This should be part of the due diligence, and it should be part of the understanding of the deal. One of the things that you're always looking at is kind of, are you going to continue to have autonomy? Are you bringing something different that, we need to protect a brand because of what we purchased? Or are we buying in some skills and things like that that will integrate very well to something that we already do, but it will lift it up. As you talk about something like innovation and all that, sometimes the boutique off to the side that's got 100 people can make your 2,000 people very effective by bringing new skill sets. So I think, first of all, you have to start with what are they bringing to the table, and what is the agreement? One of the big things, if you're being acquired by a $220 billion organization, CEO of the new subsidiary probably isn't going to go to the board, because the board is probably dealing.
They don't have room. They don't have that many seats.
They're very unlikely to go on the board, but they may not even go into the board. We've made some pretty big acquisitions on various boards that I'm on, and maybe they come along at some point to tell us a bit about their business and all, but they blend into the rest of the management structure. Sometimes those individuals, thrive in a great way, and they end up becoming, leaders within that bigger company. Other times they start with an earnout, because often when somebody who's created something and they've been a founder and they love the entrepreneurial lifestyle and all that, the reason they're selling is because they're wanting an exit, that, they want to retire. They want to go, enjoy the fruits of their labor. And so you do an earnout arrangement where, they stay to do certain things, and then they're planning to go. But one of the things you're always interested in is their bench strength And, if they go, what does that mean to the company? And, do they have some very strong skills that may be able to be lifted up within the wider organization? Because that's one of the selling points for the people coming on board is, the career path has broadened considerably. They're going to they're usually going to integrate into some of the base systems, whether it's the HR system, the finance systems, the risk management systems. And sometimes that can be challenging. I've brought on some pretty big companies who, may be purchased by a US or Canadian company, and they're not used to the SEC type of oversight. And like, why do we have to do it that way? That's really stupid. Well, it doesn't matter whether it's stupid or not. That's what we're required to do under certain regulation in the United States. So I think people understanding some of the things that they're going to be obliged to do and some of that can make their life easier because, they don't have to worry with, whether or not the desktops are, working or not, because there's the big structure to do that. But then some of the other things get frustrating because of the fact that they don't have the autonomy and freedom to make the moves. But that's where socializing it, the integration is really important. People spending time understanding the new members and what they bring and making sure that they understand why we're doing things the way they are, the bigger, the mothership, if you will. But the work starts long before the money transfers and the employee business cards change.
So look, access to resources, access to markets, access to capital, access to PR, all these things skyrocket. But on the negative, layers of administration, HR requirements, compliance requirements, layers of managerial oversight, right? The hierarchy, the gap between a CEO of a $2 billion business versus the decision makers of a $250 billion business, that gap is very real. Yeah, I'm thinking back to my days at Citibank. That gap was very real. And no matter how big an impact you thought you were having on the business and its operations, there was layers and layers of management on top of you at a young age.
When you're talking about layers and layers, it's almost as if you are implying that they're not necessary, because you can't take a company that's, one of the companies I'm on has 250,000 employees. You can't just have one layer because you don't have enough interaction with the teams and things like that. So you do have to create, but you want to create them in the most efficient way possible. People need to understand really what are the guardrails of the decision making that they can do, because there are certain things that you're going to give people a lot of autonomy, and there are others where we're going to have zero tolerance. And things like safety of employees may be an area of zero tolerance, whereas how you approach new clients, you may have a little bit, you may be required to use the same logo and brand, but you may have some other approaches to how you go that locally. The layers, are also, an indication of the fact that you're probably, if you're 220 billion, you're probably in some different adjacent sectors. You're in a lot of different geographies. You're in a lot of different, smaller, bigger, all those kind of things. And whether you call it layers or just different, structures, they're necessary.
Yep. The structure of scaling. Right. I totally accept the point. I don't want to suggest that I don't. I totally accept the point. But it's the transition from A to B, which is, it requires adjustment, and adjustment equals work. Whether it's justified or not, the adjustment is real. And on top of that, from private to public, serious adjustments. So let's assume that this CEO who has been acquired into a $250 billion business is fortunate enough, and they make it all the way into the boardroom. Let's assume maybe they're bringing $50 billion of additional revenue. So large enough, material enough that they're demanding a board seat, and the parent company feels generous and they give out the seat. And let's assume this CEO becomes CEO of the entire company as part of the transaction. What advice would you give the CEO to get the most out of this board that they've just joined, this big public behemoth board? And what would be the big difference in the CEO speaking to this new board versus the CEO's prior experience advising his or her prior board that was private and much smaller in scale, domestic versus international?
Well, but I think, you're not talking small when, if you say a $50 billion acquisition, you're not talking about a small company. Okay. No. So I think that individual, particularly if they've been CEO of a $50 billion company, which, as you say, would probably be the only kind of path to that person being CEO of the $200 billion company. They've got that kind of experience. They've already worked with a board, because even private companies of that size will have boards.
Very few.
Yeah.
Very few. These are the top 0.1%.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't think that it's so unusual for them. So they're not coming into a completely unfamiliar environment. I also think when you have those kinds of changes, there are almost always changes around the board as well, because if you've acquired something that big, it's more than likely not a twin. It's somebody who's, slightly different. Maybe they are somewhere in your supply chain, upstream or downstream to who you are. It was felt that would get synergies to do that, or maybe it's a different geography or something. But they will have had that experience running something big. And then when you bring the board together, again, going back to the board matrix, it's really important that you're sitting down and saying, well, okay, we've added all of Asia now. We didn't have Asia before. So we need some Asia people on the board, people who with Asian experience on the board. So the board should probably begin to evolve as well, which the CEO should, in my view, not necessarily be the one who picks those board members, but they should be involved in the decisions around that, working with the chair and or lead director.
So I want to bring you back to healthcare. So you've been on the board of one of the most famous healthcare companies in the world, and you've been on the board of some of the most famous companies in other industries. How does healthcare compare to these other industries at that level? Is it more international, less international? Is it more risk averse, less risk averse? What were the comparison points, the vectors that you've focused on?
Well, I think healthcare is, as the Brits would say, a broad church. So if you take certain things are very domestic, the experience of national health, where you've got in the UK that has a single payer model, that's quite different than the model that you have in the United States, where we have thousands of payers. It's a lot. So geographically, it can be quite different. On the other hand, when you get into pharma, well, we may have a lot more branding in the U.S. and a lot more litigation in the U.S. and a lot more buyers, which actually drives up the cost of pharmaceuticals in this country, in the U.S. versus other countries where they've got, again, a single buyer who is negotiating, and the winning companies, get the whole population or half the population if they have two providers, and they don't have the branding. You watch television internationally, they don't have every other advertisement is on the latest, I won't name a brand name, but pharmaceutical, because those decisions are made locally. And when you pick it up at the pharmacy there, it's in a little brown paper bag with your name and the prescription on it, staple closed. So
it's a wonder that they have any ads at all.
Well, why would they? They have other things to advertise. Apparently, crisps are very big. Potato chips. See a lot of advertisements for those. And chocolate, which I really like.
Lots of chocolate.
Yeah, lots of chocolate, which is good. But so you do have some things that even if the product is different, I mean, you might have the same formula for a drug, it may be completely different out of the UK or France or Canada than it is in the US. But a lot of that is societal in terms of how we drive things. And then of course you get into things like medical devices. And again, you've got approvals in different countries who go through different things. I mean, it's funny because there are certain prescriptions that I can buy at my home in the UK over the counter that when I'm here, I have to get a prescription, and vice versa. So these are things that if you're a big international, you have to provide for. And even if you think of something like, try not to be political, but women's health, we've got 20 states that have one view on women's health and 20 states that have a different view on women's health. And if you are filling those prescriptions or you're a doctor, doctors group or something like that, it's going to be different depending on where you're based by state in the United States. So I think, there's a commonality in that everybody's objective is to, make people healthier and all, but there's also an element of making people wealthier with those who are running these businesses, particularly when they are public or private, but commercial versus government owned, because we do have a lot of government owned healthcare particularly in other parts of the world. So it is a very interesting Sudoku to be navigated for a multinational in the healthcare space.
Would you say that every industry that you've been part of is entirely unique, or would you say some industries are more unique than others?
Well, I guess by definition, all of them are unique. But the interesting thing to me is, so if you take me chairing an audit committee in financial services and in healthcare, chairing two different audit committees, both of them have external audit, internal audit, compliance, health and safety, anti-money laundering, technology risk, cybersecurity, etc. So in some ways, the difference between stringing white beads and stringing blue beads, you're still stringing beads. But you also, when you think about something like regulation, HIPAA is going to be very different than what the Fed requires of a bank, but regulation comes into it. And as a board member in particular, what you're mostly going to be interested in is, do we have the people, the processes, and the technology to allow these things to be managed, particularly if you're in one of these big companies where it's got to be managed across 250,000 employees or 100,000 employees. And you've got to have the right people in place, because boards meet every couple of months. And now that, we're having interactions in between, like some of the ad hoc ones, or not ad hoc ones, but the regular ones I was talking about before. But our job is basically to make sure we've got the right people in place and they're getting the right budget to support them in terms of executing against their job. And that's whatever sector you are, sales is a part of it. Cost management is a part of it. Funding and investor relations and all that. So there's a lot of it that's actually more similar than different.
So there's more similarities than there are differences. I agree with you about that.
I think so.
So last question for you. Ernst & Young, almost 30 years. You rose from the mailroom, proverbially speaking.
Mailroom at that time, M-A-L-E, but okay.
Yeah, the hero's journey. You rose from the bottom all the way to managing partner and board level positions globally. And you really got to know what it means to consult at that level. We're in a very interesting time for consulting, where companies like Booz Allen and E&Y, but more Booz Allen, who my understanding is, again, don't hold me exactly to the facts, 8 to 9 billion of their $10 billion in annual revenues is US federal government contracts. I had no idea until recently. They're basically a federal government outsourcing machine in disguise as a consulting business. As you think about consulting today and the big 10 brands that really represent 90% of the spend, at least in the Western Hemisphere, what's going on there? How did they end up in this place where seemingly no one is really rushing to do business with them, and everyone seems to feel a little bit taken advantage of on pricing versus value generation? And I know that is a loaded question, and it could be completely off base because you're on the inside of what actually value creation is taking place. That's not English. That's not grammatically correct, but you follow what I'm saying. So correct my bad thinking.
Well, I think you're very cynical, I have to say, because, as you know, I spent nearly 3 decades
It's the journalist in me.
The journalist, and I see. Well, I spent nearly 30 years providing services to clients, and and there were occasions when, I chose not to because of discomfort with the client, what they were seeking to do and all of that. But now I'm on the other side, and I'm a buyer of a lot of those services. And I have to say that, on the various boards that I'm on and have been on, we continue to buy from those same companies. Now, I think we're better buyers, and, the buyers get better over time. And, there was a time when you were bringing new information to clients all the time. Well, now, ChatGPT, the hiring that people do themselves, you look at the number of boards that have former McKinsey, strategists on the board, or the number of people who have former Big Four audit partners, chairing the audit committees and things like that. So you have quite a lot of those skill sets. And I think that, I'm a tougher buyer of those services than some of the buyers that I sold to back, I'll call it, in the day. I will challenge legal fees, or another one, where that gets a little bit out of your consulting realm. But I think that's an area where there was a time when you hired a law firm and they just billed you and you just paid it. Well, we don't do that now. We sit down with them and we put them in, how much is the estimate for this? How are we going to make sure that we control that? Where are we going to have our touch points? So I think that the buyers have gotten smarter. I personally, I would be concerned if I were running one of those consultancies now if you were too reliant on any one client or client group, because diversification is critical in a world where, sometimes you're in boom, sometimes you're in bust, sometimes you're in, government intervention, other times you're not. And I think diversity is an important part of success in those big consultancies. And that's, the bigger ones, they have a lot of sectorial diversity as well as the types of services that they provide, whether it's system implementation or whether it's strategy or whether it's audit or whether it's tax or whether it's due diligence on, So I think making sure that they're being strategic and thinking about how they run their business is critical to their success.
A much smarter answer than my question was. So I don't know if you've elevated my question or demoted it, but it was a great answer. I'm going to take the other side of my own question and try to give myself an answer too. I'm going to say, look, a lot of the frustration in healthcare, especially from large health systems, towards the many millions of dollars that they've spent on the Boozers and the Bains and the McKinseys, in many cases on a monthly basis, with very little to show for it. And I've heard that feedback anecdotally in person directly many times. A lot of the blame for that lies in the client. So it takes two to tango. And when you get a lot of information and you don't act on it, it's not always the group giving the information. The other argument I'd make is good news doesn't travel anywhere near as fast as or as far as bad news.
That's correct.
So when we read the books about plunderers and the McKinseys and we read the headlines on newspapers, it's not like we're going to wake up every morning to, McKinsey does it again, another happy client. That's not a story that any journalist is writing anytime soon. And yet those case studies are happening every day all over the world. And they're delivering and transferring value all the time, every second of every day, hiring the best people who are motivated to do that. And the last thing I'd say to myself, actually, the last thing I'd say is stop asking stupid questions. But the second to last thing I'd say is consulting, I think, is a verb like breathing. And it does change all the time and adjusts to the current needs of the marketplace. And so sometimes it might be in the adjustment phase. And so a little out of step with what the market presently needs, still selling what it needed 6 months ago or 6 years ago. But if you look at consulting measured in centuries, consultants, I went to a local museum and Thomas Becket and Thomas More were consulting to Henry VIII. They didn't get to keep their jobs, but for a while they did a pretty good job. So consulting has been around for a long time and will be around for a long time, but you can be sure that it will continue to evolve.
There's actually, if you want to go back into the Bible, you can read where Moses had advisors, just so you know.
There you go. Even further back.
But I will make a comment, though, as you say, that bad news, I think, travels faster. And a really good example of that is in the audit profession, which is consulting of a form, if you will. And there are literally millions and millions of audits that get done every year that achieve the results that they were meant to achieve. But let me tell you, who gets the headlines is the one failure that you have. And then that will get headline and regulation will change and law.
The Enron audit, most famous audit in history.
There you go. Well, and I can name others. So I think that there is that, but I also think that sometimes people who complain about consulting, you sometimes hire a consultant to say something that you already know is true, but I think it was Jesus that said, no man is a prophet in his own city. I think he was talking about Galilee. But in that sense, people get frustrated with the fact that they have been saying this over and over, and nobody believed it until McKinsey said it, or no one believed it until PwC, or et cetera, through the 10 names. But that's a service.
That is such a good point. And you and I have been there.
Yeah.
We've both been with clients that now that you agree with them, they go and do the thing, because until that point, they weren't 100% sure. And 99% or 90 or 80 was just not good enough to actually elicit the action. That's a wonderful point. Jan, I'm saying thank you. I hope you had fun.
I did. I enjoyed it. I hope it achieved the objectives you had for this.
Oh my God. It's shining and rising like a phoenix.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
I appreciate it. I'm going to follow up with you after that. Thank you.
Well, as I said, I'm very quite passionate about governance, so it was lovely to have some time to talk about it.
Me too.
Thank you for joining us on Analyzing Healthcare. Stay informed and stay inspired. Don't forget to subscribe and visit scale-community.com to become a Scale Community member. Until next time, keep exploring the ideas that shape our healthcare systems.